Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Humphrey. I'm the Executive Director at the EU-ASEAN Business Council. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for those of us that are in Asia, or this morning for those of you that are joining from Europe, and I think there's even one or two from the States, so good evening to them as well. Welcome to this webinar, which is to mark the beginning, or the launch rather, of our data governance paper in ASEAN, which we launched this morning. You'll find copies of it on our website. We have with us today a very esteemed and indeed very senior panel of experts to help us talk about the issue of data governance in general and particularly in ASEAN. I'm very pleased today to welcome Yongzi Kin, who's the Assistant Chief Executive for Data Innovation and the Protection Group at Singapore's Infocom Media Development Authority, and he's also the Deputy Commissioner of Singapore's Personal Data Protection Commission. Kin oversees IMDA's Artificial Intelligence and Data Industry Development Strategy, and in his role at PDPC, he oversees the administration and enforcement of Singapore's Personal Data Protection Act, including the management and formulation and implementation of policies related to personal data. Good afternoon to you, Kin.
Afternoon.
We're also joined by Bruno Gencarelli. He's the Head of International Data Flows and Protection Unit at the European Commission, where he leads the work on data protection in Europe. He's also formed a key role in negotiating on the EU's legislative reform programme and in EU-US data transfer arrangements. He was also a key player in the development of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, as many of you will know it. Previously worked in the EU's legal service team and as an assistant to a judge at the European Court of Justice. We then have Pat Budi, who's joining us from the ASEAN Secretariat, where he is a senior officer in the Information and Communication Technology and Tourism Division. And there he coordinates ASEAN cooperation and ICT-related policies and regulation. He was previously a senior researcher in ICT strategy at the University of Indonesia and holds a doctoral degree in computer and information science from Ohio State University. And then finally, we have two of our key members from the Business Council joining us as well. We have Claudia Chan. She's Senior Director, Government Affairs, Southeast Asia at SAP, where she works in SAP's thought leadership, public policy, and strategic engagements with governments and stakeholders in Southeast Asia. He's previously held similar roles at Google, Lazada, and Seagate Technology, and Claudia also co-chairs our Digital and ICT Committee. And finally, we have Sandra Liu. She's Senior Counsel, Head of Privacy for Asia for Refinitiv, based in Hong Kong, where she advises on data privacy strategy and practice for Refinitiv across the Asia region. She previously worked at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner for Personal Data in Hong Kong, where she was Senior Legal Counsel, leading a team of lawyers and legal experts, advising on the development of personal data regulations and rules in Hong Kong. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get into the discussion, my colleague Shangari Kirpalani will be giving us a quick overview of our new data governance paper in ASEAN. And so with that, I'll hand over to Shangari, please.
Thanks, Chris. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So before we kick off the webinar this afternoon, we thought to perhaps share a few key insights that we gathered from our data governance paper, which Chris has mentioned, we launched earlier this morning. However, before I do that, I thought to perhaps set the context as to why data governance has become so important, and especially so for ASEAN. So perhaps let me explain to you guys the why now question. Firstly, data has arguably become the most important asset for businesses in the region, whether directly or by indirectly taking advantage of global scale data infrastructure such as cloud computing. Many businesses has enabled access to cross-border economic activity. This in turn has allowed for small businesses to tap into traditionally untapped and inaccessible markets. This has led to global cross-border data flows growing by over 45 times in the past decade. It has also been estimated that by 2025, 463 exabytes of data will be created each day globally. And how much exactly is 463 exabytes? Well, that's a production of more than 2 million DVDs per day. Therefore, right now, the global economy is experiencing somewhat of a shift. Data flows are now contributing more to economic growth, and ASEAN is no stranger to this trend. Last year, the region's internet economy crossed US $100 billion, a threefold growth in barely 4 years. ASEAN is also expected to unlock its $300 billion internet economy in just 5 years. With 125,000 new users coming online every day, ASEAN has the third largest number of mobile phone users and has the fourth largest number of internet and Facebook users. This makes ASEAN one of the most richest data regions in the world. At a time where data is seen as the new economic engine, it is crucial for ASEAN member states to build a strong foundation of progressive data governance policies that are both business-friendly and are able to promote secure cross-border data flows. So, how has ASEAN as a region collectively responded to this new trend? Well, their responses have been somewhat comforting. In 2018, ASEAN endorsed the framework on the digital data governance. This framework is aimed at promoting effective data governance while ensuring that data is consistent, trustworthy, and does not get misused. As you can see on my screen, there are 4 key pillars. I will not get into the details of this framework, as I believe that Pak Budi from the ASEAN Secretariat will share his insights on this later on in the presentation. However, I would like to bring your attention to the deliverable as part of the first pillar. The work at the EU-ABC by this webinar and our paper that we published earlier this morning is aimed at supporting the newly established ASEAN Data Management Framework. So what exactly is the Council advocating for? Well, the EU-ABC strongly endorses the need for policies that promote cybersecurity, data security, and data privacy. This is especially crucial now given the COVID-19 endemic. The endemic has put data governance in the spotlight as more countries in the region are in varying levels of physical lockdown. This has resulted in millions more citizens taking onto digital tools such as video conferencing, telemedicine, and home-based learning. This has placed greater importance on data security and privacy protection. Therefore, we propose for governments to create regulations that take full consideration of GDPR and ISO standards. We believe that this will not only minimize complexity for businesses, but it will also reduce the cost of doing businesses, especially for SMEs. Let me share with you a bit of details about these recommendations. The idea is to understand, firstly, for ASEAN leaders, that data is the lifeblood of the new economy, and data localization policies do not support its growth, especially at a time where the cross-border data flows is contributing more to economic growth. Instead, we encourage ASEAN leaders to take advantage of leading security technology to promote cross-border data flows instead of forcing companies to store their data locally. Secondly, we are trying to advocate for interoperable data classification framework. A data classification framework that is interoperable simply means that the same type of tiers and standards should be used across different sectors as far as possible. Our paper critically examines how exactly companies can go about executing and developing such a framework. The fear that we feel that businesses have reached out to us and have told us is that they are fearful of ASEAN governments making very complex data classification frameworks, which could result or could be seen as data protectionistic policies in the long run. Therefore, to counter such outcomes, we are proposing for an interoperable data classification framework. Along with that, we are hoping for ASEAN to be GDPR compatible. Let me explain. The idea is for ASEAN not to reinvent the wheel, but to borrow the current frameworks that are already occupying the data privacy space. As such, we hope for ASEAN to be GDPR compatible, where some, not all, just some elements are adopted to local law. When GDPR and local law requirements are compatible, we believe that the cost of compliance, while also benefiting from good governance regimes, will be significantly reduced, especially for SMEs. We also recognize that GDPR does not have any technical standards attached to it. Therefore, the use of ISO standards is recommended. ISO standards are pretty much international standards. So we believe that this will help SMEs build trust with different partners regionally and globally. Details as to how businesses, both small and large, can apply different ISO standards throughout the data lifecycle can also be found in our paper that we published earlier this morning. I think I will stop at this juncture, but feel free to reach out or raise any questions if you may. Back to you, Chris.
Chris, I think your mic's muted.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'll try that again. Right, so thanks, Shankri, there for that brief overview of the paper itself. I hope all our panelists have had a chance to review it. I know that Claudia was quite heavily involved in the drafting of it, and we've also had some valuable inputs from Pak Budi and from Bruno as well. So thanks for that. And indeed, PDPC, your colleagues, Zikin, were also quite helpful in developing the paper. I think I'd like to kick off the discussion actually by asking all of our panelists generally what data governance means for you in your own particular organizations. And perhaps Zikin, you'd like to answer that question first and give us the response as to what data governance means for Singapore and perhaps to read across to the broader ASEAN region.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thank you to USABC for this invitation and a chance for me to share our view of data governance, right, and how that is an important component of data protection or effective implementation of data protection. I think that the way we look at data protection is really, you have a set of principles, right? And the principles, I think we can more or less, if for the academics, we can more or less trace it back to the OECD guidelines in the 1980s. Of course, over the decades, there have been some evolution, there were different strains here and there, but I think that there is a large amount of coincidence, and that because of the common the origins, right? And there's a great area of commonality. But data protection is one of those areas where the principles are not too difficult to understand. It is the implementation and the application of these principles to the things that we have to deal with in daily life that poses the greatest challenge. And to us, data governance really is that emphasis of it's really what are the governance frameworks and what are the governance structures that you are putting around how an organization has taken in data, how it is managing data, how it is making decisions around what it is using the data for, right, and how it is making use of that data. It's really the practices, and I think that by placing emphasis on putting these proper governance structures, right, in place, putting the proper governance processes in place, ensuring that the people who are involved in these, who have got roles in these structures and who've got roles in these processes, understand what their responsibilities are, creating that culture that brings the people together. That is going to be the key to success. It's going to be the hallmark, right? And that's one of the reasons why we place a lot of emphasis on governance frameworks. And we don't just say that we place emphasis on these things. You can look at the things that we've done in taking accountability as a principle, converting it to governance frameworks for the use of data for AI, converting it to a governance framework for the use for trusted data sharing, where willing companies are coming together to collaborate and work with data, right? So, and also in the kind of accountability practices that we have promulgated and which we want to encourage companies to put in place within the organizations, precisely to make sure that the structures are there, the people in those structures know their role, and that they're making decisions on behalf of their organization, and they have certain responsibilities to make sure that they make those decisions correctly, ensuring that policies are translated to processes, and the people involved in those processes are well trained, and the processes are observed, so that decisions around the handling of data, the management of data, are well observed, right? This will drive good quality data. This will enable the use of data by companies in this modern digital economy. And I want to just end off by saying that the emphasis we place on good data governance really is a recognition that these days we need to move away from over-reliance on what the consumer is able to understand and the kind of consents that we can obtain from consumers. We need to really understand consent of consumers, and consumers' participation in that process is important and necessary where relevant, but it has to be complemented by good, solid governance frameworks and processes within organizations, so that we place the responsibilities and we hold the organizations responsible for making use and for being the good custodians of personal data that they are. So that's a short view of why we think data governance is important, and the kind of emphasis we place on promoting good practices around data governance.
Thanks, Asean. Bruno, if I can just perhaps turn to you, you can try and give us the overview from the European standpoint. In Europe, of course, you've got GDPR, you've got very well advanced regulations and policies already. And perhaps you can also give us some flavour what was driving measures like GDPR in Europe.
Sure. Okay. First of all, can you hear me, because I had problem connecting? Yep. Very good. So first, thank you very much, and in particular to the EU-ASEAN Business Council, and congratulations for that excellent paper. I wake very early this morning to be able to read it. It's a very interesting document. First of all, let me fully subscribe to what I've just explained. What has just been explained. For us, data governance is, first of all, I would say, sound data management. It's mainly, and I will say it very briefly, it's mainly about having a culture of responsible use of data, putting in place operational rules for those dealing at all levels of an organization with data, and ensuring appropriate data protection, data security. In our experience with the GDPR, we have seen that those rules, based on principles such as accountability, privacy by design, risk-based approach, have been very useful. The implementation of the GDPR in Europe, the application of the GDPR, now we are celebrating almost 2 years of the entry into force, or entry into application of the GDPR. We have seen has been, first of all, an opportunity for companies to put their data house in order by taking a closer look at what data they are collecting, what they use it for, how they keep it, do they share it, etc. And answering those questions is, first of all, important for organizations for several reasons. First, answering those questions allows you to, as a business, to reduce exposure to unnecessary risks. Complying with those rules allows companies to being better prepared to avoid, for instance, security breaches, or be more responsive in case of such incidents, and therefore being able to mitigate the consequence of such incidents. this is far from being insignificant when we have in mind the financial losses or the reputational damage that, for instance, data breach can cause. But answering those questions allows also business to often get a better idea of what data they hold and how to better exploit it by developing a more trustworthy relationship with both their customers and commercial partners. What we see is that privacy is increasingly also a selling point, as more and more users value the privacy and security of their data, and we're observing on the marketplace the offer of innovative products and services with novel privacy or security solution. Many companies are actually saying that privacy is increasingly becoming a competitive differentiator on their market. And more generally, because you asked me why we did this. We did this for many reasons. But we did this for the same reasons that are leading many countries around the world, including, of course, in the ASEAN region, to modernize the data protection rules, because we wanted to have rules that could address both the incredible challenges, but also the incredible opportunities of the digital economies, and the digital economy. Sorry, and that's, I think, a similar vision that both in ASEAN and in the EU we are sharing. We believe, and I believe this is also true for many, if not all, ASEAN countries, then in today's world, and more than ever before, privacy needs to be effectively protected as part of a human-centric approach to the digital society. And that means that we need clear rules of the game to protect, of course, individuals, but also to allow data to move. First of all across sectors, but also from one country to the other, across borders. This rules of the game also to develop a trustworthy use of data. We recognize that having such rule is an economic necessity. Without consumer trust in the way that data is handled, there can be no sustainable growth of our increasingly data-driven economy. And that's, I think, why both in ASEAN and in the EU, privacy is a central component of our respective digital policies. We will probably talk a few minutes about the current pandemic crisis. We also see how much it is important when we are developing technological solutions, and we are all in Europe looking at what has been developed in your region, in particular in Singapore, and we have seen how it is essential to have I would say, from the early stage to develop those solutions with strong protections. That's key to ensure the effectiveness, first of all, the acceptance of such solution, to make sure that such solutions can be rely on to fight something like the pandemic. And therefore, this is about the success, the usefulness, the effectiveness of, for instance, those tracing contact apps. It's, in a certain sense, a confirmation of what I was trying to explain briefly. There must be, and I'm very happy that in this moment it seems that our two regions are working in the same, more and more in the same direction. There must be this sort of vicious circle between better protection of privacy, enhance consumer confidence in how their consumers' confidence, how their data is protected online, and then that can in turn contribute to the further growth of the digital economy, and that means the economy in general. So that element, I think, of trust is something which is that not only all of us are seeking, but that is also essential to ensure, and privacy and modern privacy rules can significantly contribute to that.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. It's very interesting because the EU has a very advanced system now in place. Pat Budi, you're trying to coordinate efforts across the ASEAN region. So we have 10 countries, 10 different approaches perhaps. Some are adopting a much more open policy towards data and data flows and data governance, and some a lot more restrictive. Can you perhaps just try and give us a flavor of where ASEAN is at, the moves it's trying to make, and where you think it's going to be heading?
Yes, thank you, Chris. It's a long process. Basically, you don't expect to see anything operational within 1 year or 2 years. So that's a long process. So first of all, the need for data governance is obvious for ASEAN, because we want to attract investment and attract businesses or innovative businesses that nowadays rely on data as the raw material, because value creations through the availability of data is something that is everywhere. And now people are concerned about privacy breach. People are concerned about unfair monetization of data and all that. So obviously countries might suddenly close their, restrict the use of data for all of those fears. So it's important for ASEAN to have a data governance framework so that the users are confident in using data-based solutions, and also businesses can operate or create innovations using data. So that is a practical reason why we want governance in ASEAN. And also data governance will allow, because obviously services, online services, is not restricted within one territory. So we have multiple territories. Your cloud service can be in Singapore, in Thailand, in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, whatever. So that is the need to harmonize the way governments put in place rules. So if the rules are compatible, then we can ensure that data is protected when it's transferred across the borders and vice versa. So I think this is the aspiration of ASEAN, because we know we want to be, we don't want to be left out in this digital economy way. If you want to be innovative, you want to be able to use data. Just for example, nowadays people are trying to do contact tracing, and suddenly government says, oh, this is privacy issue, we can't do this. All the telecommunication operators are willing to do it, but then we don't have the rules in place to say yes or no. And so that is the something that is practical, that needs to be done quickly, but we cannot do it because we don't know what is the rule. And that will take a long time to get some consensus on that. So that is the background. And so now we're working on, as Sangari mentioned, the big ticket item is the cross-border data flow. And in the development of that cross-border data flow mechanism, we also look at GDPR, we look at APEC, CDPR, and also some some best practices that we base on, and then we look at the options, and we try to ensure that there's some echo, somebody. Yes, could you, yeah, I think we need to mute some of the microphone so that it won't cause echo. Yeah, thank you very much. And so, yeah, I think we are in the process of developing the mechanism for cross-border transfer. We are relying on model contractual clause, just like the GDPR standard contractual clause. We also look at the EU models and the CVPR as well, and trying to find the one that is suitable for ASEAN, which is mostly SMEs. We cannot afford high cost of applying these rules. So we're trying to make it more modular so that SMEs have options in building the contractual clause. And we take the lesson learned from European, from GDPR, where trying to, responding to data subjects requests is really going to be costly for SMEs, for example. So those are the things that, among the things that we are looking into. And also we have the third-party certification that would be applied to member states who have their own data protection authority. So that will make it easier for data processor or data controller. We call it data sender and data receiver to have trust, to be marked as trusted. And so, yeah, I think we are in the process of doing it. It's a long way to go. In fact, we worry about later on whether some of the jurisdiction will allow the use of this mechanism. For example, there are issues of law enforcement, where, for example, in Vietnam, maybe they want data to be within the territory, because then they will be able to seize the data for criminal investigation. And so those are among the reasons why data need to be copied within the territory. So that is among other things. So we need to work on with the domestic legal frameworks or the legal infrastructure to make sure that that will be conducive to the mechanism that we are working on. And there's also on data classification, but that's another thing. Maybe I'll stop here for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Pak Budi. I think we should try now get the view from the private sector, from Claudia and then from Sandra, about what data governance means for you as organisations and how you approach it, and perhaps some ideas around what the private sector might like to look for from regulators such as PDPC or even the European Commission. So, Claudia, perhaps you could tackle that one first.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think what data governance means to us is very much was shared by the other panelists. It is about the good data governance framework, and also I think to address some of the concerns that Pak Budi brought up on the concerns of governments, why there are some perhaps more restrictive legislative structures or frameworks that we're seeing, is because they were concerned about what about the security and the privacy of the users or companies, for instance. I think how that could be better addressed perhaps would be companies like ourselves, the solutions and the products designers, the makers. We need to adopt a privacy by design, a data security by design type framework. And I think this aligns with also what Zakin has said. It is about the implementation. That's the greatest challenge that we see. The frameworks part is not the most difficult part. It is difficult. It's a laborious process, but it's not the most difficult. It's I think the day-to-day battles, the execution, the implementation, where we see the greatest challenges where it stands. And I want to move on to the sideline also to share about the future of, for instance, what Shangri has said, like for ASEAN, and also Pak Budi alluded to it as well. Billions of dollars are at stake for investments and the economy. That's, I think, the thing that's pulling us forward to the future. But at the same time, what's happening right now, we need to build the right foundations and the policy infrastructure in order to help propel ASEAN to that positive future. And I think the current crisis that we're seeing in terms of COVID-19 crisis, we're seeing increased huge, I think, growth both in terms of breadth and depth on the usage of technology, for instance, and especially in terms of cloud-driven technologies. And that requires a world whereby you allow data to cross. It's not about keeping the data in the country. It doesn't mean that's safe, but it's a matter of how do you treat the data, the treatment of the data. And if I were to put it in layman's terms, what is that good data governance culture and hygiene? How do we deal with it every day? And as what PDPC shared, what are the processes in place? We need to inculcate in people a new way of understanding data, even if ourselves as personal users, consumers, that we treat data privacy as that first principle. I think that is becoming at the cultural level a behavioral change, and that's very important because the future world is mobile first, is cloud first. It's a much better, I think, infrastructure and trend to help companies, especially SMEs. Majority of economies in ASEAN are driven by SMEs. They need to move forward fast at a reasonable cost. We need to have a more equitable structure whereby it's not just the bigger companies that can benefit, but the smaller companies, the citizens, and everyone can benefit. And we feel that in terms to promulgate that future world, a cloud-driven world, a mobile-first world is the most likely route that's for that future to happen. Yeah, so that's our view.
Thanks, Claudia. And Sandra, sorry to come to you last, but perhaps you can give us the view from Refinitiv. You're working in a world where you're handling tons and tons of financial data globally. So how does Refinitiv approach this key issue?
First of all, thank you for allowing me to join this wonderful panel of speakers. I would like to congratulate the papers. I mean, it's very informative. From the previous speakers already touched upon a lot of areas like policies and et cetera, et cetera. I won't be repeating myself on those policies and also governance and things like that. But from a company perspective and from a financial sector perspective, we possess a huge amount of data, and we are the top user of IT services for handling data. Well, just to elaborate slightly, the financial services sectors, including the financial institutions and also financial information service providers, we gathered financial data and customers' personal data. Well, customer data, what we mean by traditional kind of data like identifiers, customer profile data, etc., biometric data, etc. And also, on the other hand, we have handle a lot of financial data. The ecosystem generally may cover the reference data, the identifier that makes it clear to what data refers, say, for example, legal entity identifiers, fundamental data that describes the underlying condition of the financial sector, say, for example, tax revenues, corporate earnings, etc., and market data as well. For example, data relating to security transactions, pre-trade, bids for offers to buy or sell security, post-trade records of transactions that have occurred. So now also there's a rise of a new source of data called alternative data. What we mean is corporates gather about their operations. These kind of data can be extremely useful to others. Say, for example, credit card transactions, metadata, etc. All these data that the financial sector possesses in such a huge amount, and they can be of great real value to the system and also to the customers. And some of these data sets, especially alternative data sets, fall into the category of unstructured data category. Well, how data governance help will be, when there are fragmented and diverse data sets with lack of coordination, lack of policies, lack of decision-making process, roles and responsibility, it makes the institution very difficult to see the whole elephant and draw wrong conclusions, in the sense that, say, for example, questions like, is this customer trustworthy or creditworthy? Is this transaction fraudulent? Oh, how can we be able to better identify patterns that can suggest financial crime or transaction fraud? And there may be also other potential and valuable competitive intelligence on these databases, which can be extremely helpful. And when all these data come together, we meet the concept of data governance, which I would describe as a management concept concerning the capacity that an organization should embed to ensure that they understand what data they hold, how that data flows throughout the organization, and how they ensure that data is fit for purpose it plays a very significant part of business success. And I would say data protection principle cannot exist in a vacuum. We need these management concept and implementation policy, rules, and protocol to help us to navigate the regulatory challenges which can be posed by data protection regulations, risk management, and other sector-specific regulations. And more importantly, to help organizations like financial sector or financial services information providers to generate insight and derive the biggest benefit on its own data in a lawful, compliant, and ethical manner. And I also agree that with data governance, and it also enables us to become a competitive, can act as a competitive differentiator, which can win customers' trust and also regulators as well. So, I mean, for the business sector, I would supplement from this perspective to the views already mentioned by the other speaker.
Thanks, Sandra. For our audience who are listening in, if you do have questions, please use either the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens or the raise hand functions, and we'll try and get round to you, or I can read the questions out for you. Zikin, one of the issues I think that businesses face, particularly in this part of the world, is that we do have a number of different regimes, despite the best efforts of Pak Budi and his colleagues to try and coordinate things across ASEAN. And businesses mainly would tell you that the freest possible flow of data with the right safeguards in place, of course, is good for them and good for business. But sometimes you're coming up against authorities who are pulling in the opposite direction. What's the Singapore view on this? And the Singapore approach is probably one of the more liberal ones in the region. And how do you work with trying to persuade your ASEAN colleagues to take a similar view to yourselves?
Well, I think that the overall approach that we take is really, I think as Claudia mentioned, recognizing that today, whether you're a brick and mortar company or whether you are born digital, the opportunities are for cross-border trade, right? For regional growth, right? And for reaching customers using technology, right? And you're no longer confined to just your domestic markets. Once we agree that that's the starting point, then people very quickly realize that you want to keep your borders open to data flows because you want your own businesses to grow and to venture out into the region. And you also want your customers, or rather your citizens, your residents, to be able to benefit from the best of breed and the most competitive and most the kind of services that can be offered to your domestic markets, and not just confine yourself to what your domestic players can offer, right? So the benefits are to your own businesses and to your own citizens. Now, with that as a starting point, then we will find common ground to recognize that data has to flow. Now, we don't for a moment say that we believe in free flow with no checks, right? Because when it comes to data in general, let's not confine ourselves to personal data. Data we have recognized, I think Pak Budi has mentioned, right? Data is the new assets, right? Is an asset. As an organization, as a manager of a company, as the board of directors, you want to protect your assets. You want to make sure that whoever takes your assets, right, or you hand it over to, right, is trustworthy and will not run away or work with the assets such that it destroys the value. So that is a principle that businessmen understand, right? And it's fundamental to value creation and creation of partnership. And it applies to not just personal data, it applies to all kinds of data. Now with that, with these starting points, right, when we come and talk about a cross-border data flow, that's why we have a lot of emphasis on governance, right? Good practices. The principles, I agree. In ASEAN, well, ASEAN is really just a snapshot of what Asia is like. ASEAN is just a little bit of a mirror of what Asia is like, right? Because in Asia, coming into data protection, we have the whole spectrum of, you can imagine. There are certain jurisdictions with long histories of data protection laws, right? There are some countries like Singapore, as an example, Malaysia, right, where we came upon it and we've been doing it for the last decade or less, right? And then there are the ones who are just thinking about starting or still considering bills in draft stage, right? Still in consultation or working with sectoral laws. So that's why for us, we have to find a solution that works for this region. So while on the one hand, we want to strive towards a set of common principles or principles that we can agree on, we recognize that those principles will develop as more jurisdictions introduce laws. They tend to look more and more similar as we update ourselves, right? We always take and look at the latest benchmark and we try to make sure that we emulate the latest benchmark. So as more laws are introduced, they will become similar. But I think that in the meantime, let's get the governance practices in place. Let's get those practices in order. And having managed IT operations in my previous life, everything we've just talked about today, data governance, has their roots in good, right, IT and data management principles, right? And those are pretty tried and tested, but many times not observed as religiously as we would like them to, right? So it's really a question of let's get the structures in place, let's get the processes in place, but most importantly, let's get the people to understand their role in it and why they have that role so that they can perform that role properly. Because without that understanding, the structures, the governance structures and the processes will come crumbling down. So that's why we believe that using, emphasizing governance, right, is the absolute a way to go in this stage, right, of I would say the maturity of data protection in the ASEAN region, which, as I mentioned, is a bit of a mirror of what the Asian situation is like.
Okay, thanks for that. Bruno, to come back to you, during the development of GDPR in Europe, perhaps you can give us some flavor of the way that regulation emerged and your thinking around data governance emerged, and the degree to which industry in particular was consulted, or even NGO groups as well. Any lessons perhaps from the process you went through that ASEAN might want to think about drawing upon?
Yes. Does it?
Yeah, you're okay. Can hear you.
You may? Yes, sir. Yes. Thank you for the question. But what I've just heard confirms once again that we have so much to learn from each other, ASEAN and the EU. Also because we are looking at the same issues and facing similar challenges, starting from what was very well explained now, the challenges of regional integration, the challenges of developing a system which is both protective of data for all the reasons we have discussed and open to data flows, which is what we have sought and we are seeking to further develop. So I was very interested to hear, in particular from Budi, the work that ASEAN is doing on model clauses, because that's, for instance, a very practical, important tool. Is the most for us. It's the most used tool for data transfer. It is particularly cost effective. I'm thinking especially of SMEs, small and medium enterprise, which might not have the resources to use more costly, sophisticated tools such as certification, for instance. It is model clauses at the same time provide for legal certainty, because those are sort of off the shelves instrument that you can use
precisely because they are model standard clauses, and at the same time can provide for flexibility, the possibility to adapt those clauses to the needs of your industry, your specific feature as a business. And it's very interesting and quite revealing that both the EU and ASEAN are right now working on this tool. We are trying to modernize our model clauses to make them more business friendly, more adapted to the diversity of transfers, the diversity of relationship between, for instance, from processors, data processors, and it's actually a very important, a quite unique opportunity that sort of maybe a coincidence, but interesting coincidence, that through that tool, both the EU and ASEAN have a possibility to build more convergence between the system. This is not about having the same system, but building on those commonalities that we have stressed since the beginning of this conversation. In our experience, data protection tools and transfer tools can be very useful to complement other type of agreements that our region or our country may have. I'm thinking about trade agreements. We have seen this with the work we have done in the past with Japan, creating the biggest area of data flow in the world. What we are now finalizing in these weeks with South Korea, and as you know, the EU has a number of free trade agreements with a number of ASEAN countries. Singapore, Vietnam is negotiating other agreements with other ASEAN countries such as Indonesia. The EU is the second trading partner of ASEAN, and in that trade, the trade in service is a particular growing element. So being able to have tools that facilitate the free flow of data within your region, but between our two regions, can usefully complement those trade agreements, as of course data flows are an increasingly important part of trade. So we are very much looking forward to those developments in ASEAN, and to, while we are, as I said, working on the same tool, trying to work in the same direction and share experience and know-how. To come back to your question, our process was, of course, a long process. When you work on privacy, you have to, of course, always keep in mind that privacy, first, data is an incredible asset, and that any rules on privacy affects a very wide range of stakeholders, from a small business down the street to the big multinational businesses we know. Of course, also big impact on society as a whole. So in our system, and of course, before even proposing a legislation such as the General Data Protection, the GDPR, we went through a number of public consultation, 2 or 3, which with answers from the widest ranges of actors, stakeholders you can imagine, from civil society to the big Silicon Valley companies, the I don't know, Association of European doctors, medical doctors, because they are also affected by such. But they were all asking, they were essentially, with of course differences according to whether you are in a data intensive business, but they were all asking 2 or 3 main things. First, harmonization. Doesn't make any sense in today's world, in a business such as the data business, which is almost by essence cross-border, to have fragmented rules. So, and that's why we went for a regulation, which in the EU system is the most the legislative instrument that can bring the highest degree of harmonization. Modernization of our rules in the sense of introducing elements such as the one which I think also are bringing our two regions together: accountability, risk-based assessment. You don't need necessarily to have the same rules for a very mundane processing compared to the processing of very sensitive data such as health data. So this idea of adapting the rules and the prescriptive nature of the rules to the risk of the processing. In general, moving away from too prescriptive rules and making the best of the concept of accountability. And that was very much at the center of the discussion we had. And we're continuing. Of course, once again, a legislation such as the GDPR needs to remain quite general in its principles, and the real success of any data protection legislation is to be technological neutral and to be able to be adapted to developments, commercial development, technological developments that you couldn't even foresee when you develop those rules. And that's why there's a lot happening at the level of the implementation, the interpretation of those rules through tools such as guidance. We last week issued the guidance of, in the context of the current pandemic on contact tracing apps, and in general, guidance are also open to broad consultation, and this is also a way for us as on the public side to learn and to get, for instance, best practices, needs of specific sectors and businesses being fully factored in and taken into account when developing those further rules that interpret and in a certain sense give flesh to the rules that you have in the legislation. And in that process, what we call data protection authorities, regulators, are very much key actors because they can bring those they can adapt the rules of our GDPR to our this fast evolving developments that of course characterize the data economy, and I would say more generally the data society we're all living in.
Thanks, Bruno. You brought up an interesting comment, I think, in the middle of that, which is about the different types of organizations that regulators are having to deal with, and they're rolling out policies and regulations around data governance and data flows. So at one end, you have the very small MSME, mom and pop shop type thing, through to huge organizations such as an SAP or a Refinitiv as well. And indeed, you mentioned the use of model clauses. Well, model clauses only work, of course, where firms actually are using contracts, and a lot of MSMEs won't be using contracts. So how can we, as a complete ecosystem of regulators, policy developers, and indeed large businesses, help to work with some of these MSMEs and smaller businesses to help educate them? Because a lot of this is going to be around education for data governance and protecting data going forward. Perhaps I'll ask Pak Budi for some thoughts about what ASEAN may be thinking about in this respect, given the size of MSMEs in the area, and perhaps Zikin or Claudia or Sandra might want to come in as well.
Yes, Chris. I think that's important. The keyword is educating. In ASEAN works, we try to promote a common way of classifying data based on risk. So it's a risk-based assessment. This is something that, surprisingly enough, not all businesses familiar with. So selling the idea of common way of looking at data. So we have a data management framework. Part of it is the classification framework, where we look at what data we have, analyze what's the use, and then try to assess the risk based on the confidentiality breach, the integrity, tampering, availability, and we look at the try to quantify the risk, and then we know what controls we need to put in place for specific data. So this is an education for many of us, many in ASEAN, especially the SMEs, even governments. Some ASEAN governments are surprisingly told me that they're not aware there is such a framework for risk-based data classification. So we're trying to have a same language in the same approach in classifying data, so that you know what it is the risk of your data based on the use, based on some of the other characteristic or parameters, and then based on that, then we can easily say, okay, please keep my data with certain controls in place, because we have the same understanding what are the risks of the data being tampered with or being breached and all that. So educating the governments as well as businesses is most important one. So this is why the data classification is taking longer than the cross-border data flow for ASEAN to develop, because to build this understanding or common understanding on how you classify data based on risk is taking some more time. We know that the European has this data protection impact assessment thing. It's part of the part of the package of GDPR, and we are doing similar thing, but we try to build from the foundation, trying to make people understand how do you assess the risk of data based on your business processes, based on the characteristic of your data and all that. And of course, some SME may not care about that, but then we will have to sell the idea, the future idea of having a network economy where value chain is actually distributed. You have another component of your value or supply chain residing elsewhere. And so you don't have to have your own vertical lines of production. You can rely on other, especially SME. SME can rely on other entities outside their country to do the other part of the value creation. And so selling that idea will basically drive the necessity of having a common way of protecting data, of governing data. So this is a long way to go, but I think we don't want to be left behind. So we need to develop the understanding that SMEs can even go global by participating in global value chains. With that, you will obviously exchange data, you will share data, even hopefully in financial sector, as Sandra mentioned, you will have data scientists set up a company that will help banks or other financial institutions to do getting some insight and creating some values and all that. So it doesn't have to be residing within a company. It could be in various companies as a network economy. So this is what we are selling. We're selling the opportunity for SMEs to participate in the global value chain. To do that, you need to be able to have a common way of protecting data or looking at the risk to your data. And based on that, then we can build some more governance, trying to harmonize, as Zikin mentioned also. So this is the progressive steps that we are taking. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Zikin, from the Singapore perspective, I mean, it's perhaps easier to reach out to companies in Singapore than it is in some other ASEAN member states. But what sort of processes are you putting in place to try and teach people about good data governance?
Yeah. Well, I actually wanted to just build on what Pak Budi said, right, about data classification and the work in ASEAN before I come back round to answering the question that you have. posed to me. To me, I see the work that we've started in ASEAN to be absolutely crucial, right? Classification of data is really so that businesses understand the intrinsic value of the data. If you can take a name, a postal address, right, a telephone number, email address, right. If it's a business, look at it. Okay, lah. So this is just data. But if we tell them, hey, this is your customer relationship management data, suddenly they realize, oh, this is my customer lists, right? I need to protect it well, right? But a few of the data items in the hands of your shipper might actually be, hey, this is what you need to get the goods to your destination. Then he realized that, wait, this piece of information, I need to protect it enough, but I also need to ensure that I pass it on to the next guy who can actually complete my last mile delivery. So I think by classifying it in a way that businesses understand, we achieve two things. One, it gives them a sense of how they need to protect it while it is in their possession, while it's in their custody, right? Data at rest, right? How do they protect it, right? And then also, when they realize the value of it, right? When it is in transit, when they are moving it down the value chain, whether it is to deliver a bag of chips that I've ordered from e-commerce vendor, right? Or a bunch of flowers to my loved ones, right? Or to receive payments. Then they also understand that I need to make sure that in my supply chain, when it's dealing with this category of data, I need to have the right kind of practices in place to protect it in transit. Now, once they understand that, right, then the next thing that we try to do is really to present a set of standard contract clauses that they will be able to then use that, yes, this is a business-to-business relationship, and hence this set of clause will make mention of different types of obligations, and they will understand, yes, okay, this is how I need to put those protections in place, and this is how I'm selecting my business partner. Or it is a business and supplier point of view. Then in that case, they understand this is a set of obligations because I'm taking this, right, and I'm delivering a part of the services and I have certain expectations. So to us, it is absolutely important to get these things right? And the classification must be done in a way that SMEs understand and speaks to them in a language that they get, right? Because with that understanding, it translates into very, how should I say, very commonsensical and very commercially driven ways of ensuring that they protect the assets that they are working with. And the contract clauses is meant to help. We, of course, are a bit more ambitious. We want to talk about certification at some point in time where we can have independent auditors, right, who can take a look, right, to see whether your practices are in place. But those are things that we have kind of like put and say, in the future, let's get the basics done first, but in the future, let's build up to that, right? So coming back to Singapore, I think that that's kind of the same kind of message that we have to bring to our business as well. While we are fortunate is that it is a fairly modern city, everyone's close together, it's easy to reach out, right? But packed within this small island, we have the full range. We have the mama shop, right? The mom and pop, right? Small, mom and pop shop in our housing estates. We have the global multinationals, right, as well, right? Which could be just 2 MRT stops down in the neighborhood center. So we have the range as well, and we bring this insights because we've been engaging with the whole spectrum. We know what SMEs struggle with, but we also understand that for them, the kind of data that they deal with and the expectations they have out of data are a little bit more confined. But it doesn't mean that we cannot bring to them the message that work well with data, because unfortunately or fortunately, one of the silver linings of this particular COVID-19 pandemic has brought is this awareness that even the hawkers, even the small F&B businesses, when we are in a situation where we have very high social distancing measures, where people are encouraged to stay at home, if they went online, if they went digital, they can still do business. They can still participate in the economy. They don't have to fear the complete shutdown. It is terrible economically, but it is possible to still shift your business elsewhere. Now, and I think a lot of the smaller F&B businesses, even in Singapore, suddenly realize that I need to make sure that I know how to make use of digital technology, and suddenly instead of facing a customer, I need to talk about e-payment system. I need to know how to speak to the delivery a network chap, right? So that I can understand the orders that are coming in, and I need to prepare it so that I know that the delivery guy is going to turn up and he's going to pick it up from me, right? Small businesses need to understand that. And I think that if they understand that even with their scale of business, they are working with data. And if they work with the right partner, the right platform, the right delivery company, they have trust in the whole supply chain, customers will keep coming back, right? Customers it will be sticky. So I think that that's the kind of message we bring to SMEs, right? While for the larger regional operations, the multinationals, it's really a story about let's emphasize on these good practices, which we want to be fairly universal, right? Because what we want is for you to, if you've done your data protection impact assessment, if you've done your legitimate interest balancing test for Europe, right, or you've done it across your organization, we want you to be able to take that work, come into Singapore and say that the work's done, it can be used here as well, very minimal additional effort required, interoperability in action, right? So that's why we are a firm believer, right, in this set of practices.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we're all quite clear COVID-19 is going to drive a lot more in the terms of digital economy. I'm very conscious of the time, so I've got one final set of questions for each of you. But first of all, for Claudia and then for Sandra, perhaps you can just briefly outline what you as large-scale businesses hope you can do working with regulators in the area of data governance and data classification, and what it is you're looking for. So perhaps Claudia first.
Yeah, I think one last point we would like to drive through is that in terms of data governance, it's important to make it holistic at the core, especially for bigger firms who can shoulder on the responsibilities, because it will flow downstream to the users, to the SME, to the individuals. So privacy, data protection, cybersecurity need to be at the core, not just in terms of processes, but in the design, in the development, in the day-to-day running delivery of those services. It needs to be part of our DNA, because we are serving many ecosystems, so that's very important. It goes down also to the architecture, the data centers and things in the cloud that we do. So I think bigger firms need to shoulder that responsibility, and it's important because that can't be shouldered by the smaller players. And what we do at the heart, if we do it well, then I think the beneficiaries will also flow down to the wider ecosystem, as panelists has mentioned in this call.
Thanks, Claudia. Sandra, from a Refinitiv point of view, what would you like to see from regulators?
Yes, thank you. I completely agree with Claudia that data protection and also not just the procedure, but also the culture, and it has to be in our DNA in order for a large corporation to perform well in data governance and protection. Just another perspective is, as large corporation, I feel that when it comes to contributing to the discussion, we can't provide information and feedback to these policies and also principles or practices when it comes along in a draft form, or when it comes along when it's in a formation stage. Sometimes I feel that innovation and also technology develop even quicker than policy making or even regulations development. So it is important for a private company to help regulators or even small company to understand what it means, and also sometimes provide case studies or use case for regulators or leaders to help them to formulate these policies. I feel that these cases and also discussions will help shaping these policies and also the practices or best practices. And hopefully we will be contributing to a more pragmatic kind of best practices, guidance, and policy. I think it's something that we as large corporation can do other than the DNA part. So I think it's key that we have a trusted channel to communicate and exchange ideas and to share information. And sometimes the discussion can be wider coverage to extend to more stakeholders. And we can also share good practices with smaller companies. And of course, for smaller companies, maybe there can be some flexibility in some of their practices as well. So I think collaboration, engagement, and trust and discussion is something that I would like to supplement.
Great, thanks. I know Bruno's got to rush off to a very important meeting shortly. So Bruno, just perhaps a quick word from you. What would you, as a regulator, like to do or like to see more from industry in this particular area?
Yes, first let me just do two very brief remarks on what I've just heard. I can confirm that our experience in the implementation of the GDPR is indeed that engagement, awareness raising, communication with all actors, and in particular small and medium ones, is essential. We have, for instance, developed a toolkit that explains for small businesses, including very small businesses, how to comply with our rules in 7 basic steps. I also wanted to react to something you said, Chris. You said, well, SMEs might not use contracts. Actually, when transferring data cross-border in this region or in your region, more and more they are required to have some mechanisms to allow the transfer to for instance, business partner in another country. So that would be more and more requirement that they will have to address. And then I totally agree with the King. In any case, they need a contract to protect a key asset of their business relationship, of their customer relationship. And what they generally want is not to have to, because of limited time and limited resources they may have, is not to have to negotiate those contracts from scratch, not to have to engage in all that legal work. And that's where standard contractual clauses or model clauses come very handy, because they are models that you can, as I said, take off the shelf and then adapt to your business needs, your sectoral needs. And certainly that's what we are hearing from businesses around the world, small and big ones, and that's the main advantage of standard clauses compared to more sophisticated, costly, and complicated tools such as, for instance, certification. What we want to hear from business, that sharing of knowledge, that sharing of good practices, that sharing of best practices, which allows us, of course, to understand better how those rules work on the ground. And the European Commission will, in a few weeks, issue a first report on the 2 years of implementation of the GDPR that will have that very practical angle based on the feedback we receive from business and other stakeholders, and also trying to identify what still needs to be done in terms, for instance, of clarifying certain rules and certain principles. But also those good practices, those best practices, helps us. Once again, I believe here in Europe, as it is in ASEAN, to develop that convergence between our respective systems in a way which can help businesses navigating between different systems. And businesses are the best place to bring that knowledge to us as they are indeed active, especially when they're active in several jurisdictions. So we are already working very much with stakeholders, and I can imagine that we will only work more with them. I hope, and I see good opportunities for that, also in the context of this EU-ASEAN work.
Thanks, Bruno. So Zikin, same question for you. What would you like to see from industry to help you?
Well, I think for us, it's really hearing directly from them, right? And this is a call that I made to those who were present in Singapore, and I want to broadcast it to everyone here as well. We talk about classification, we talk about model contract clauses, right? End of the day, what works best for ASEAN, right? What are the common business relationships that we need to take take into consideration, and how do we categorize them so that we can design a small number of model contract clauses that will cater for them? When we talk the example I use about classification of data, what are the labels that will resonate best? And small businesses will relate to and know how to use this kind of classification, because as I mentioned, once they understand if the label is meaningful to them, then they will instinctively know what they need to do to protect it while it is with them, right? And how to pick the right business partner to transact with, because they want to make sure that their assets goes to a good partner. So what are the labels that will help? We've got a few that we are working on, and we think it will be helpful, but the nature of business is going to, well, we need more feedback, right? We need to hear from businesses more, so that the kind of labels that we are coming out with for classification, the kind of relationships that we can bunch together for different model contract clauses, those will speak to the constituents that we are trying to serve in ASEAN. So that is actually my plea, right? To hear more directly about what's going to be meaningful and how we can make the work that we are doing useful.
I'm sure we at the Council can help you with that aspect. Okay, my final question is then to Pak Budi, and it really, a question actually some in the audience that has asked, is the extent to which ASEAN is getting some support from dialogue partners or donor partners, particularly in providing thematic experts in this area.
Yeah. First of all, ASEAN is committed to engage with the private sector. Usually we get the use cases from the private sector, from companies operating in the region, and that is very useful. So yeah, we welcome. In fact, there will be some engagement with the private sectors planned further down along the line this year, but it's subject to the situation with the virus outbreak. So, but yeah, I think engagement with the private sector is our commitment. So we will get the feedback from the private sector, from businesses operating in the region, especially the use cases, because to test a model, you need to have, to simulate it against some use cases. So we welcome all the use cases. With regard to, engaging with dialogue partners, I think I need to ask my working group on data governance, which is chaired by Singapore, whether they will finally allow European government to come in, and because we always focus on private sector's engagement, but we don't do much with G2G, because we try to consolidate our approach first, have a common view among ASEAN member states, and then once we are solid, then we'll engage with. But obviously, specifically from European Commission, we learn a lot from European Commission. So I think we will be happy at some point to engage with Bruno and the team, revising or upgrading the GDPR. So that would be very useful dialogue with the European Commission, I believe. So, but yeah, I think I have to consult with my my working group on that. So, but yeah, that's really planned. Thanks.
Thanks, Pak Budi. I won't
Sorry,
embarrass you.
if I can just jump in a bit to answer Pak Budi's question. Actually, we had planned for something, right? But we were actually working for something. If I remember, it was March. I think it was late last year, early this year. But things kind of like got into a mess with this COVID situation. But there are plans. Once we have sorted out and come to a clearer view in-house, we definitely have been speaking with Bruno and to make sure that there will be a set of contract clauses that will work for the trade that goes on between ASEAN and Europe. And we've always found those conversations very, very insightful and very helpful.
That's excellent news. Thank you very much. I think on that great note, we'll come to an end. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for your time and taking part in your insights. Thank you for everyone that joined us on this today. And look out for more webinars coming from the Business Council in the near future. And with that, I wish you all keep well, keep safe, and stay at home. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.